Capitalism. You like this? So
Aspects of it. What is capitalism? Capitalism is an economic thing that takes advantage of human greed. One thing that is forgotten about anything that has to do with collective interaction is that so long as it accomplishes the aims for which it is tolerated or encouraged, okay. When it becomes dysfunctional, then it stops. That is a characteristic of most of the rules in the world, whether you're talking about economics, whether you're talking about capitalism, or you're talking about law. When the reason for the law ceases to exist, so must application of the law. When the reason for the principle ceases to exist, so must application of the principle.
right. Um,
So when greed gets too far out of hand, laissez-faire capitalism, which reared its ugly head 120, 130, 140 years ago, when it was a new thing as applied to the circumstances enabled by technology 130 years ago,
mhm.
it has its dysfunction now. One of them is that America, unlike any other industrialized nation, does not have any sort of governmental plan to deal with the rapidly advancing obsolescence of ordinary labor. Labor is a commodity, and when there's a glut in a commodity, there are three things you do: cut back production, subsidize the producer, store the surplus. We put our surplus labor in a jail cell. The subsidy is the public assistance check, and the cutting back of production is all this stuff we were just talking about relative to glorification and dysfunction for 50 years. The youth take themselves out of the job market. They don't get properly prepared academically or vocationally. They think they're entitled. They don't have a work ethic, and it goes to hell. And that quickly creates a situation where they now have an excuse, whatever it may be, from white supremacy to mommy always did it to I want it. Why should I have to work for it? And you get stuck on stupid, remands itself into stuck in a penitentiary, remands itself into not employable, therefore cutting the pressure down in the labor market. The government needs to do something about that, but it doesn't, because we're capitalists and we must leave it to the free market. But the free market is not in the business of charitable functionality, it's into the business of profit making.
I just realized my broadcaster is not hooked up to the computer, and my microphone is from the computer and not this. I just, I, I just came in today. I just flew back in today. I got in after 6, got home close to 7. So yeah. But anyway, I think I still sound clear.
You
Question.
sound perfectly clear, in fact, more so than usual.
Oh, okay, so this is probably better than this way. And I have this in my ear. I'm like, why do I'm not hearing nothing? I think I had a blonde moment because I'm like, I don't hear anything out of this. It's because it's not hooked up. Um,
Are you having more fun if you had a blonde moment?
I know, yes. But I did
Why
get
we
pissed
would
off.
be.
I got pissed off right before I left, but that's a whole nother thing. Um, I'll tell you about that later. But anyway, when, how, and who created capitalism? So when did it start? Like when did this whole concept of capitalism begin?
Middle
And hmm?
Renaissance, Middle Ages, increased trade between Europe and the Far East and to the Middle East and Africa. That's when it started off. You can go back to the Islamic world, which took off from well, the Greco-Roman world, which also was based on the Egyptian and Mesopotamian principles of setting up banking institutions, and the fact that since somewhere documented in the middle of the last ice age, about 50, 60,000 years ago, it's been apparent in the fossil and archaeological record that humans all over the planet have attempted to interact with each other more and more for purposes of trade and exchange. So capitalism comes out of that. One of the reasons that Rome is no longer what it used to be is because it fell as it expanded to a huge population, including just the free Roman citizens, somewhere around the 3rd century, that had jumped up to around 180 million people, which was the population of the United States back in the 1960s. So that had capitalism hadn't invented itself, and the economic model for Rome was bread. Not bread, but bad for an empire that size. When you say bread and circuses, it's interesting because when Caesar spoke that, he was literal. In Rome and in the large Roman provinces, there were large Roman urban areas, and in them, literally, the government doled out bread every day. So, bread and circuses, I think in Latin it's done pane. Pane is bread. A circusier. Circuses is circus. Now, so give them bread and circuses, and Rome had problems with its foreign diplomacy and the need to send the legions out quite often because there was not sufficient grain to grind into bread for the bakeries that were contracting with the Roman government to make bread on a daily basis for the citizens of Rome, meaning not just the city of Rome, but for the entirety of the empire where it was civilized.
So capitalism is not always bad. Like capitalism is needed, I think, to keep the economy thriving.
You need a blend. See, like the Soviet Union, the epitome of communism. Well, I read a treatise that was written in 1919 by Lenin, a translation. He said, right now, Russia is not ready to become a democratic nation. He said, it will not reach that point until there are no significant numbers of Russians with a living memory of their enslavement under the czars. He predicted that that would be in the last decade of the 20th century, starting in 1990, when glasnost and perestroika would come into play. And that's exactly what Gorbachev said in 1990 when it started getting apparent that the Soviet Union was disbanding. Under the and they had advanced to the point where they no longer had to be communists. They could embrace capitalism. And now the former Soviet Union, Russia is probably more perfectly capitalist than the United States is. And it's interesting.
How so?
Well, free enterprise. There are no holes on the process in Russia now compared to the United States. We found out 120 some years ago, 100 years ago, what happens when you don't rein in capitalism and you have what they call laissez-faire capitalism. That's a French word. Essentially, anything goes, and it started working a lot of evils in the general population. And then you have the People's Republic of China, which is interesting. They are quite socialist in terms of their interaction with each other. But China acts as a sovereign investor and is fully invested in the capitalistic process, but as a monster entity with the deepest pocket in the world. So this banking thing we're talking about with SVD, it'll probably be brought under control, and the inflation when the Chinese sitting behind the scenes start pulling their strings, and they say, we suggest you check your records of investment, and you'll see that umbrella corporation, this, that, and the other that is invested in you. If you go further, you'll see we're the ones that own the majority of the stock in these companies. So, back off. You're not going to do it. Oh,
Right.
wow. We didn't realize. So, right now, we have an interesting thing, whereas capitalism, as represented by stock exchanges and free investments, i.e., putting up capital so that it earns, and the capital being used to collectively finance larger and larger economic operations, the controlling and stabilizing entity in the capital process worldwide is nominally a communist nation, China. Intriguing.
Don't judge him, Joe Brown.